The RMA is broken and everyone knows it.
The RMA is akin to a gale force headwind, battling any attempts to develop anything anywhere.
The RMA has enabled a cottage industry of lawyers and consultants drafting thousands of pages of papers and reports, all designed to block new roads, new wind farms, new apartments in our central cities and farming in rural New Zealand.
It tangles progress in a web of process and absurd conditions. Our reforms are going to rationalise the system in a way that stops every Tom, Dick and Harry from objecting to things and weaponising the planning system to block progress.
It's the culture of no that I spoke about earlier in the year brought to life. Kiwis are sick of it, I'm sick of it, we're all sick of it, and now we're taking action to completely dismantle and scrap the RMA and replace it with fresh legislation that just lets Kiwis get on with it.
Hi, I'm Alexia Russell, and today on The Detail, the RMA, the Resource Management Act. There are changes in the wind again, so I'm going to ask the Deputy Political Editor for the New Zealand Herald, Thomas Coughlan, to talk us through this flawed but important piece of legislation. Thomas, welcome again to The Detail.
Hello, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Look, now, I know you are a student of politics, so can we just go back to the beginning and get a brief summing up of how this Act came into place in the first place?
Yes, certainly. So the RMA, it's best to think about the RMA as one of these pieces of legislation that emerged out of that great period of reform in the 1980s and early 1990s, when a bunch of politicians came in and really swept the decks of the statute books and set the regulatory and economic settings that we're still living with today. It's best to start perhaps with thinking about what the RMA does. Basically, all resources that we use, you think about the land that your house sits on, the air that you breathe, the forests and the countryside, the land that our farms occupy, all of those are resources that we use to some extent. And we need laws to govern how those resources are used and the effects that our use of those resources has on ourselves and other people. You know, if I turn my house into a pizza restaurant, for example, that's great for me, but the smoke from my pizza oven that's going all the time is not going to be great for my neighbours. And so we need laws to govern how the effect of my actions has on me, the environment and other people.
So does it include waterways?
It does include waterways, yeah. It includes everything. And I think when we think about what the RMA does and what it did in 1991 when it was legislated, resource management was balkanised. It was split across dozens of different pieces of legislation. Prior to the RMA, you had things like the Public Works Act and the environmental anguish that was provoked by the Manapōuri hydro scheme and a lot of the southern hydro schemes during the 70s and leading into the 80s. So there was a lot of environmental angst about the effect we were having on the environment. What the RMA did was it repealed more than 70 of these statutes and regulations. The earliest statute that it repealed was the 1889 Kumara Sludge Channel Act, which was a piece of legislation that Parliament passed to govern a channel that protected some kind of mine, so far as I can see. So that
was on the West Coast.
Yeah, and that's sort of what resource management was like prior to then. You'd have these, Parliament kind of intervening in every little thing and governing how different resources were used. So you have pieces of legislation like that. You've got the Hawke's Bay Rivers Amendment Act, the Geothermal Energy Amendment Act, the Town and Country Planning Act. You can sort of get the picture that resource management was spread across all these different laws. And the RMA consolidated it all in one place so that there would be national laws governing how our resources were used. It was going to be very simple. It would be very easy. It would protect the environment so you wouldn't get the sort of the kind of Manapōuri issue happening again. And it would do this by setting rules that would be recognisable across the whole country. You'd have national policy statements, which would be rigorous guidelines about what councils could and couldn't do, and that would be the way things worked going forward. Now, fast forward 30 years, and the RMA has kind of grown in size through multiple amendments. Governments have not really issued as many national policy statements as they should have done, which means that the governments have kind of vacated the field in terms of telling councils how to do resource management. That means that across the whole country, you sort of have a repeat of what was the problem before, which is you've got different rules in Bluff to Napier to Auckland to wherever.
So it's become piecemeal again.
It has become
Yeah.
piecemeal again because the government's just vacated the fields and hasn't issued enough national direction. They have done more recently, but for decades after the RMA was issued, we didn't really get much of this direction. And that's the problem that this is trying to solve.
Yeah, so your statement that it would be very simple, it is, I presume, no longer very simple.
Yes, the idea was it was meant to be, I suppose, much like, the Public Finance Act and the Reserve Bank Act and all of these great sort of 1980s and 90s pieces of legislation, you were meant to have this great period of reform, a new regime brought in that was very clear and concise and almost sort of beautiful for its precision. And instead you've got this piece of legislation that's been amended time after time after time. The legislation has ballooned in size. It's hundreds of pages long now, and it's a sort of it has become the thing which it was meant to destroy. So now we're in this period of reforming it once again.
Our goal in government, our first duty as elected decision makers, is to create the best public policy we possibly can create. The RMA has been a disaster for 30 years. It is the direct cause of the most unaffordable housing market in the Western world. It is a direct cause as to why it is impossible to build infrastructure in this country. It is one of the reasons that is driving our energy shortage. It has been a millstone around the neck of the New Zealand economy for far too long. Our goal is to completely replace it with new laws based on the fundamentals of a market economy, which is private property rights. We are going to do it.
That's the Minister responsible for RMA reform, Chris Bishop. But Labor reformed the Act too, and just like National's new plan, introduced two pieces of legislation to replace it. Bishop was asked at a Beehive press conference why the government didn't just tinker with those changes.
Labor's reforms were a disaster. They introduced wholly complicated new legal terms that were unknown to New Zealand law. They stuffed the legislation with a whole range of conflicting goals and objectives that made it impossible for anyone to negotiate the system. This RMA is 900 and whatever it is pages. The NBA, the National Built Environment Act that Labor passed, was longer than the RMA it was replacing in a system that was designed to be simpler.
For legislation like this, which is so fundamental to how our country is run, does it require bipartisan support? Has it traditionally had some bipartisan support?
Yeah, well, I mean, the original RMA, it's often associated with Geoffrey Palmer, but it was, of course, passed by a national government when National was in government. And yes, I mean, these are rules that predominantly affect councils. So that they would usually require, well, not require bipartisan support, but given it's such a fundamental part of our economic and legislative settings, bipartisanship, it's probably a good thing. You don't want to be changing it a lot because every time you change stuff like this, then all of the councils have to change the way that they look at things. And it starts to get very costly for councils. It starts to get annoying for businesses that are using this. I mean, I was looking at my notes and I did a detail episode in 2021 on RMA reform. And so we've been doing this for a very long time. The RMA has been repealed and replaced by two pieces of legislation under Labor. The National and the opposition didn't agree with that at the time. It repealed those pieces of legislation that the RMA was replaced with, the National and Built Environments Act and the Spatial Planning Act. It repealed those two pieces of legislation and brought the RMA back. It's now amending the RMA for a couple of quick fixes, and then it will repeal the RMA again and replace it with two more pieces of legislation. So the RMA is a very rare piece of legislation that has actually been repealed twice.
Wow. And I mean, the funny thing about it is, while it's so integral to New Zealand, it's so dense that people can't get their heads around it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll put up my hand and say that I haven't read the whole thing, and every time you think you understand it, someone comes along.
There are whole lawyers with a career in this.
Yes, if you do understand the RMA, I imagine it's very, very lucrative. But yes, no, it is incredibly dense, and you do you'd feel for councils who are at the hard edge of this, and they're obviously very constrained in terms of the money that they have from rates. And interpreting the RMA is very, very costly for them. It leads to a lot of litigation, which is also costly for them. Yes, it is a difficult and costly regime.
Can we go through what the national government plans for this? Because some of it's press release on it is really interesting, and it talks about things like weaponising the RMA.
Travel around the country and you'll see examples every week of growth and opportunity being blocked by busybodies weaponising the Resource Management Act.
And also getting rid of references to treaty principles.
There will be no generic treaty clause in the new legislation. So the RMA right now has a treaty clause which is a generic uphold the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. Cabinet has ruled that out.
So the way that the treaty has worked in resource management is the RMA did include a treaty principles clause, and it has been one of the most powerful treaty principles clauses. It has led to a lot of litigation in the ensuing few years. The Labour bills to replace the RMA included a strengthened treaty principles clause, so it slightly intensified the wording around the treaty principles clause.
So this is one area where there is no bipartisanship.
This is one area where there's no bipartisanship. This legislation will take after the fast-track legislation, which had a treaty clause which said that it would honour existing treaty settlements, because most treaty settlements include resource management applications, because the iwi that the settlements pertain to have rights under Article 2 of the treaty to certain uses of their historic lands. And so resource management is really one of the key areas of treaty litigation.
Look, no decisions have been yet made about how the plans will be put together and who will get to contribute, but I think it's really important to acknowledge that iwi and hapu have specific treaty settlements that provide for their participation in the resource management system, and we intend to uphold those settlements.
Can you sum up what the national government wants to do with it?
Yeah, so I mean all around the world, in the United States, the UK, and here as well, a lot of really well-intentioned environmental legislation, often from the sort of 70s, 80s and 90s, has been quote-unquote weaponised to stop development. And the RMA is no exception to that. It has been very difficult, too difficult arguably, to get stuff done. You've seen recently a wind farm failing to get approval in Southland under the old fast-track regime, which is part of the existing RMA.
So the real reason that the amazing billion-dollar project that's going to electrify 150,000 homes and a whole lot more besides, and be there forever in Wyndham, in southern Southland, is because of a bat, a native bat, whose sonar capacity is so poor that apparently it might fly into some of these turbines once they're up and started.
You see a lot of densification that needs to happen in cities that has really struggled under the existing RMA regime.
Chris Bishop has had a crack at the Auckland Council's independent hearings panel after it rejected plans for an 11-storey wooden office building close to the new Karangahape rail station as part of the City Rail Link. The district plan and the way that it's being interpreted means that very few of the spaces around these stations are being taken up by high-rises, because commissioners say it would change the character of the area. Chris Bishop described it as insanity, and he's right.
And so there's been criticism that the RMA, which is part of the RMA's job, is to protect the environment, to allow us to use the resources that the environment has given us, whilst not depleting them and passing them on to future generations. That's sort of the gist of what resource management is all about. But actually, in the wrong hands, a poor resource management regime can be weaponised against development, which means that you don't get wind farms built, you don't get solar farms built, you don't get apartment buildings built, and so you have protected the environment in one sense, but you have done it by building a very costly, carbon-intensive, urban sprawl, expensive housing, socially injurious economy, because you haven't been able to use the resources properly.
We need to develop homes, schools, hospitals, ports, wind farms, gas fields, and farms, of course.
This is Under Secretary Simon Court at that same Beehive News conference.
These are needed to deliver the quality of life that New Zealanders expect from living in a modern nation in the 21st century. Infrastructure is falling apart while our population has ballooned, and now we're jumping over unnecessary hurdles trying to catch up. It's 1.3 billion annually spent on consenting, according to the Infrastructure Commission. That's an astronomical waste of taxpayer funds. At a recent peak, around 40,000 consents were demanded in a year. most of the stuff we've been doing for years. We know how to do earthworks. We know how to install a culvert under a road. We know how to build a wastewater treatment plant while protecting the environment. The RMA provides for objectors to object to just about anything, anywhere, based on a concept of effects.
So in the name of environmental protection, you've actually created a whole lot of social problems with expensive, sprawling housing and a carbon-intensive economy. And so that's the sort of potted critique of the RMA.
Can that weaponisation, though, also be a necessary handbrake at times? I mean, I'm thinking about a massive development that was planned for my neck of the woods where, the complaint was that the sewage system couldn't handle it. Then they've got the Auckland floods and there were tampons running down the river outside this development site. So it was stopped. That sort of thing is
Yes.
necessary, surely. Councils need to have the basics in place before we can do these things.
Yes, and I think that is exactly that is the sort of political conflict that we're in at the moment, is that the issue around development in areas that are going to be prone to climate change, that is an example of the system working the way it should do, and that is sort of an example of what we've been trying to do for decades, but then well-intentioned environmental protections that are designed to stop building cities in areas where we really shouldn't, are, in the eyes of critics of this sort of legislation, that is weaponised to stop really rather sensible developments. The example that's been used recently is this office building in central Auckland, I think on K Road.
Yeah, right by the new City Rail Link train station.
Yes. Precisely, yeah, and that sort of seems, I'm not an Aucklander, but to a lot of critics that looks like a rather sensible way to get more people into the city to work. And it's, the example you raise about development in flood-prone areas, that seems like a very sensible objection to intensification. But it's the stuff that's designed to stop that can be, weaponised against sensible things as well. It's like whack-a-mole, you change one one setting in a well-intentioned way and then people use it to do something else. And yes, it's a nightmare that's been unfolding for decades.
So actually you can't legislate for being sensible.
It's a real pity you can't, and people have tried.
So what is National envisaging that would solve that problem?
So on the surface, it's rather similar to what Labor had proposed. As we dig into it, it'll be very interesting to see whether there are some substantial differences, but it'll be very interesting to see how substantial they are. Two pieces of legislation again. Now, the pieces of legislation are slightly different. One of them is in sort of a development planning piece of legislation. The other one will set out environmental regulations and rules. So that's sort of how the split will work. They plan to reduce the number of land use zones.
Common sense ideas like standardised zoning will be a key feature of the system. Right now, every individual council in New Zealand determines the technical rules of each of their zones. Across New Zealand, there are 1,175 different kinds of zones. In the entirety of Japan, which uses standardised zoning, there are 13.
We're talking about, commercial or commercial, mixed residential, these sort of ones that have numbers. It's a 3A or it's a 96-1
yes.
or whatever. And those are the things that dictate when the planning committees meet, they look at the zone and say, well, doesn't fit in the zone, does fit in the zone.
Yeah, and they are the sort of bedrock of what you can and can't do with land. And at the moment there are thousands of them. It's very, very complicated. If you're a developer, the government is trying to make life easier to develop land so we can have more housing and get on top of the housing crisis. But if you're a developer and you've just got your head around Auckland's very complicated planning rules, and then you go down to Wellington, you discover that they're completely different, and you think, why isn't this one country, why isn't it more similar? And in Wellington, the ridiculous thing about Wellington is that you might get your head around Wellington zoning rules, and then you try to build a development in Porirua, or Hutt or Upper Hutt, and they're different. And, you can see these different areas. If you stand on a hill in the middle of the city, you can see, half a dozen different councils.
So
and
this
has
got to be a good move then, right?
Yes, and it's something that, again, to bipartisanship, the parties are disagreeing a lot over this, and Labor was moving in the direction of greater standardisation as well, and a smaller number of these rules, and so yes, this has a lot of support. The sort of the bespoke way that things have worked in the past, it seems to have fallen out of fashion, So yes, Chris Bishop used the example of Japan. It has just 13 zones. I think we will end up with more than 13 zones.
Yeah.
Because New Zealand, I mean, we are very environmental as a culture. Not to say that they're not in Japan, but it is just part of our DNA here. I imagine we'll end up with more, but we will end up with a lot less than 1,000.
And I guess the recent weather events, mostly throughout the top of the North Island, especially Auckland, that'll change that too. I mean, you have to have some protection so that idiots still aren't building on the edge of cliffs or in swamps.
Yes, it is interesting. One of the areas where the government is going slower on housing, for example, is because it is sort of talking to Auckland Council a lot about the way that Auckland's planning needs to change to respond to what we've learned about flooding in Auckland. And that again, Labour sort of started that, and the Coalition is picking that up as well. So again, people looked at what happened in Auckland after the floods and thought, crikey. And we might
I think
actually...
they felt a bit more than that, actually, Thomas.
Yes. I'm being polite. But I think they did. They looked at that, and it's interesting the time that happened. The floods in Auckland happened at a time when there was bipartisan support for really bashing councils over the head with forcing them to make more land available. And the councils, and Auckland in particular, was saying, hang on, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
This is something councils were up in arms about when the last government tried to force them to allow more intensification, including so-called sausage flats, or long rows of terraced housing jam-packed onto properties with windows that looked into neighbours' homes. Here's then Wellington Mayor Andy Foster by Zoom, it was 2022, making his point about urban design standards.
That is an issue which we do have concerns over. We want to make sure that development is good quality. We have had issues in the past which we've had to make changes to planning rules to try and reduce some of the poor quality, poor urban amenity, lack of sunlight access, those kind of things. We are concerned that might occur.
A lot of their submissions, if you go back to the law that created the sausage flat law, a lot of their submissions were saying, this is blunt and it will lead to problems down the track. And then the anniversary floods happened.
It was a great big I told you so for a lot of those councils.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone will admit that, but I think it certainly made the council's point in a way that a submission never could.
But gee, what a surprise that local councils know the local land better than the government. I mean, have they taken this on board, the government?
I think in the case of flooding, yes. I think I know Wellington better than Auckland, and it's areas like heritage protection that is often used to stop rather sensible development. Flooding is different, I think, because it's a safety issue. Infrastructure strain is another issue that causes councils to be more conservative. I think for the current government and Labour too, it's interesting how on the same page they are. That you've had multiple governments now that have been elected on a very strong housing crisis. Mandate's probably a bit strong, but there is a very strong desire from both sides of the House and an acknowledgement that the housing picture in particular is a real problem. And the economy as well is constrained by our inability to use the land in a more commercial way.
That's it for today, although we haven't been able to give you the details in detail because we just don't know exactly what is in the new legislation yet. The government does, however, estimate that it can slash compliance costs by 45%, saving $14.8 billion. It plans to have the two new bills into the House by the end of the year, to Select Committee by the next year and in place before the next election. The aim is to have the rules set before councils have to start their long-term plans in 2027. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Thomas Coughlin. I'm Alexia Russell. Ka kite.